Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the rogue time traveler whose errant meddling in ancient Italy ultimately led to the destruction of Pompeii and the downfall of Rome.
I was there, Trent Hergenrader.
He was there. I saw him throwing rocks into Vesuvius.
That's right.
That's what kicked it all off. And fittingly, this week, we're excited to interview one of our longtime collaborators and fellow Games Learning and Society alumni, not a time traveler as far as I know, but perhaps leading classics educator Kevin Ballestrini. Kevin teaches Latin at Mansfield Middle School in Mansfield, Connecticut, and along with myself, Trent, and a few of our closest friends, he helps run the educational game development partnership, the Pericles Group, for which he is the president and primary content developer. He's also a member of the American Classical League's Finance Committee, serves as the executive secretary of Classical Association of New England, has an appointment to the board of directors for the open source classical languages resource Alpheos, and among other accolades, was the inaugural recipient of both the American Classical League's Charles Humphreys Award for Innovative Pedagogy and the Award for Excellence in Creating Technology-Based Educational Resources. So without further ado or awkward praise, welcome, Kevin, and thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Hey, Steve, thanks for inviting me. Trent, good to see you as always.
Good to see you, yes.
So, Kevin, why don't you give us an overview of what it is you do? What is this innovative pedagogy and creative technology-based educational resource development that you've engaged in over the last 15 years or so? Now, I'm a little bit more aware of this than most because I've been there alongside you, full disclosure, but for the audience, what is it that you've tried to build and how is it being deployed in K-12 and higher ed?
You know, it's a great question. It's one that I hope I can answer because my mother has asked me probably a dozen times, what is it that I do? And yet we keep going back to the same answer. We began over 15 years ago when a group of us was exploring using the Lord of the Rings online at the time to develop some kind of engaging Latin pedagogy. We were influenced a lot by the developments in game-based learning at that time, in no small part to Jim G's book and his contributions to everything. And we were looking for a way to really reinvigorate Latin instruction. We quickly realized that the Lord of the Rings, or really any other MMO, really wasn't going to work because the play objectives just didn't align with the learning objectives, right? We were just trying to slap Latin text on top of the game mechanics, convert the quest flavor text, which nobody reads, into Latin, and then they would further no longer read the text and continue to just kill rats and goblins and whatever else. And so then that kicked us off with developing what ended up being this sprawling derivative of tabletop role-playing games, Operation LAPIS, in which the main objective is for students to learn how to think, read, write, act like Romans by playing some facsimile of a young Roman, weaving in and out of some great moments of Roman history, chasing an object known as the lapis saeculorum, the stone of the ages, which had the promise of saving Western civilization as we know it. And we look around the world today, it seems that that mission has failed miserably, but nevertheless, here we are. And so for the past 15 years, working on and off in furthering, developing, refining that, we also continued to dabble in other game-based learning enterprises. We developed a language learning card game called Werba, spelled with a V because we pronounce it like a Latinist. And that is available in Latin, Spanish, French, Chinese, and an English version for English language learners. And we developed some other card games, and then our kind of flagship, I would say our most successful endeavor was our color theory game based on collecting dragon eggs and hatching them into wonderful, beautiful, colorful dragons.
Well, I was going to hand the conversation to Trent off the bat, but
just to elevate it a little bit.
Just to elevate it a little bit. We want some classy conversation around here. But the main thing that I've been wondering since we talked about having you on is how you think about the comparison between what you're doing with Operation Lapis and something like Reacting to the Past, which Trent and I have discussed in the context of the book as well as the podcast.
No,
but
I just want to interject here because you said, I'm going to let Kevin talk and then I'm going to give you the chance to ask him a question. And my goddamn question, Steve, is how do you think what you do compares with reacting to the past? That is quite literally the question I was going to ask. So go
We're
ahead.
keeping
No,
all
no,
this in, by the
it's the
way.
Steven
Oh,
Slota show today. So
so whose question should I answer, Trent's
yeah,
or Steve's?
exactly.
I guess I'll answer. I guess I'll answer Trent's. So I would say that at the base level, the DNA between Lapis and Reacting to the Past is very, very similar. Ironically, they kind of originated around the same time, completely independent of one another. Both kind of reject the traditional passivity of learning in that students aren't just studying about these things, they're inhabiting some kind of immersion space, playing through these huge events in world history. And I would say that unlike other games and even learning games to an extent, there's no real win scenario. There's no real win condition. The point isn't to win or to beat the game. It's rather to just engage with the material in a very, very deep and reflective manner. Both Lapis and RTTP really put the focus on student agency, where the instructor is kind of just this facilitator or guide rather than the person directing all the operations. I would say, Trent, where we diverge is really the primary goals and the scope. Reacting to the past, and likely accounts for its commercial success, is broad enough, and the primary delivery language is English, right? And so the point of RTTP is to develop those argumentative skills, those rhetorical skills, and going into a deep dive into a singular moment, right? Whereas Operation Lapis is really about, first and foremost, learning the language of Latin, but then engaging in, well, it spans 28 missions each with 3 smaller parts. So when it boils down to it, you're looking at, 80 some odd reacting to the past modules strung together into a cohesive curriculum. And so that's where I would say the biggest deviation happens. Is it's almost as if reacting to the past is a singular episode inside of Operation Lapis.
Yeah, so Steve, am I allowed to ask a follow-up question, or do you want to take
I
the follow-up
guess.
question?
No, you
So
go.
this is one of the things that we touched on in the book a little bit, and I think it's funny too because, of course, Kevin, as you know, the stuff that I've been doing with world building and role-playing games is the same kind of more open sandbox game than like RTTP, which is more or less, here's a scenario, we're going to give you all of the pieces that you need, and you just need to enact it. And I don't say that in a negative way because I think in some situations that's perfectly fine, especially if that's what you're going for, is just framing that one moment. But I'm always interested in when you knock the walls down, where students will take you, right? It doesn't seem like RTTP can take you very far away from the initial rules setup, right? Where it's like, this is the goal. You need to either this side's going to win or that side's going to win. And you need to, proselytize or convince people using these mechanics. Like, this is the way it happened in history. So I think that that's useful in a sense, but I think interestingly, students, if you just give them much broader palette to, sort of experiment, they come up with other interesting things that I, as the educator or the scenario designer, never sort of came up with. And I know just in our conversations over the years, you've notice that same thing, right? So can you share maybe a couple of the things that you notice student creativity coming to the fore when instead of giving them sort of the set piece, you give them the pieces to play with, and then they build something cooler than maybe you had intended, especially having done this for so many years now and seeing so many students using this tool.
Yeah, it's interesting that you kind of bring up the win conditions for reacting to the past. And I would say it's not even necessarily a win condition, but rather quite literally the path that the student actors take within a scenario could diverge completely from reality. And without proper scaffolding and a very, very talented instructor, that could cause some significant learning. I don't want to use damage, but there could be gaps where the students aren't aware just how much they deviated from history. I think Lapis solves this by and this is extreme credit to Roger Travis, the alternative reality layer that exists outside of the actual immersion space of Lapis. And so unlike reacting to the past where students our students who then are role-playing historical figures. There's a dual layer going on with LAPIS where the students are actually operatives recruited by the teacher who is acting as an agent on behalf of this unseen entity known as the demiurge. And this kind of surreal, almost science fiction layer, this wrapper outside, allows and affords the opportunity for the students to really play with the historical and mythological stories in a different way, because the whole thing is framed by this alternate reality. So they know, hey, we're not trying to reenact Rome exactly as the way that we've come to understand it now in 2026, but rather we're operatives on this quest inside of a simulation, and we know it's a simulation, but the NPCs, right, the characters within the simulation believe that they are the historical Caecilius, the famous banker of Pompeii, which is featured in both a popular Latin textbook and in Operation Lapis, and has been on Doctor Who. And I'm sure when the new documentary comes out on Disney Plus, they'll spend some time with Tom Hiddleston, spend some time talking about Caecilius's impact on Pompeii as well. And so I think that extra layer of that fantastical element really does allow. And we've always likened it to this concept of a sandbox on rails, right? The path has been set, but each stop along the way allows the students and the instructor to get out to kind of play in that sandbox and then do some deep reflection about what that playing did, but also compare and contrast to the actual affordances of historical learning and exploration.
Yeah, I actually think the first words you spoke to me may have been, "It's a sandbox on rails," because this is one of the things too that I think is so funny is that, and one of the things that I don't have like a grudge against reacting to the past. The thing that bothers me is when, and this has happened with a number of historians, where they think that they've somehow got a corner on this magical approach. And it's like, no, like the approach is good and it's based on good constructivist learning principles. And anything that uses those principles is probably going to come out being pretty good. So it's not that it's and that's where it's like, oh, well, we don't want to do anything else because we're committed to reacting to the past. Like I've actually had those conversations and I'm like, but that's like saying that you're really committed to checkers or whatever, right? Like it's one form and maybe that form does what you want it to do, but think of all the other things that it couldn't do, right? So, one of the things too that Steve and I have talked about on some of these other podcasts is just like you said, these kinds of learning games will leverage deeper learning, but then the key is you got to make sure that they're learning what you actually want them to learn, and they're not learning, negative stereotypes are true, or history is immutable, or whatever it is. Without those sort of guardrails, that definitely can happen. Or for a very sloppily designed sort of scenario, students can come away deeply having learned something that is not what we want them to learn. But on the other hand, they often will, and we've all seen it, I think, in our own practice, they'll come up with stuff that we hadn't interpreted, like we hadn't intended for them to learn that. But then because it is good constructionist learning, they're able to apply their knowledge in ways that were more unpredictable. Do you have any like specific examples? Like I know there was one when we were at GLS years and years ago, you were talking about how one young woman talked about, flirting and using like a hairpin or something like that she had, where the students use that agency not only to apply the knowledge that you want them to learn, but they're also using their own agency and their own creativity to adapt it to things that they think make sense and are cool for the project.
Off the top of my head, the area that gives the most affordances for that kind of playing around ends up being exactly the kind of learning objectives that we seek to set out for them to master when it comes to the mythological immersions, where they kind of break from the main historical storyline that they're following to reenact kind of these major moments in mythology, tracing the course of the lapis through time and space. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that people have just in general about mythology in the ancient world is that it was this static one version, the version that we have set in stone. But the reality is all of these stories were told over hundreds, if not thousands of years by bards and storytellers, not memorizing a script, but rather recomposing it each time they told that story. And so the stories are constantly changing.
You already had Roger on for that. So
okay. All right, good.
Listen to that episode.
And so in those immersion spaces, it gives the students the opportunity to really get down and play with the myth the same way that Ovid was playing with the myths in his recomposition of them in the Metamorphoses or something similar. And so when they're confronted with being present for the quarrel between Romulus and Remus over the founding of Rome, they can come up with plausible ways to reach the same outcome, whether it's swapping a body double and allowing Remus to go off into the sunset without Romulus actually having to have killed him, but rather give the appearance of doing so. Where things come full circle, I would say, is what they take with them beyond. And one of my favorite memories was, ironically, through one of my first groups that really went through the whole curriculum. A few years after she had graduated, a student of mine was in Italy, in Rome, on a study abroad for a semester. And without kind of going into spoilers, but the lapis ends up being the keystone inside of the Arch of Titus that displays the apotheosis of Caesar. And she took a picture of herself underneath the keystone and sent it to me saying, look, I've seen it, the lapis is real, it's here in person, right? And so here's somebody who's a few years removed from my classroom in college, no longer even studying Latin, but there in Rome just by happenstance, and made it a point to go find the object that she had spent multiple years of her high school career searching for in our curricula. So that, that tells me that if our goal is extending reception and kind of lifelong appreciation and exploration, that was a win, right?
Yeah,
that was a win.
It's one of the things. One of the things too. So when I do a world building trip to southern Spain, we go through these amazing sites in Al Andalus, these remaining sites of these Muslim kingdoms or whatever. There is something that is undeniable about physically. Like, I think virtual role playing is great, but there's nothing like physically moving through those spaces and being like, this isn't just imagination. This isn't Tolkien or George R.R. Martin. This is like actual history. These things actually exist. And that's really, really hard to replace. But I think the next best thing that we can do is set up really immersive role plays that would maybe even encourage people to go see these things. Like, you can never go to Westeros, right? You can maybe go to Galaxy's Edge, but you actually can go to Rome. You actually can go to historical sites and move through these spaces that look quite different. And I'm excited about AR and other things like that, where you may be able to hold up your phone and be able to see the Roman Forum the way it looked, and then pull it down and then kind of, do that same thing. We had a flip book when we went to Rome the first time that had that, where you would hold it up from the exact spot and then you would flip back and forth. It was really, really cool. And I'm thinking that was back in the early 2000s. Right. So there's a lot of cool stuff about that. But I really take to heart that point that the embodiment of it, whether it's virtual embodiment or whether it's actual physical embodiment, does a great deal for getting people to sort of like take ownership of what it is that they want to learn and how they want to learn it. But Steve, I think you've got a boring question. Why don't you throw one out there?
Well, thank you for letting me get back into the conversation. I was thinking about the nature of formulaic implementation of something like reacting to the past versus the more ill-defined, open-ended version of what you're describing with Lapis. And it's not unrelated to this question about physicality or how you extend the classroom into these real historical spaces. Specifically, I'm thinking if I did a reacting to the past about the American Revolution, I went and visited the Liberty Bell. I'm just visiting Pennsylvania. I go see the Liberty Bell. Am I going to have the same narrative relationship between that visit to the Liberty Bell and the reacting to the past module that I completed versus doing a multi-episode version of something like that in Lapis, where I had agency that I was able to exert on that world instead of having the world presented to me as somebody who is just acting on that simulation of it? I don't know if that makes sense, but there seems to be, to me, something about the ill-defined nature of the narrative composition. And this is something we talked about with Roger too, with recomposition, the idea that all of these narratives are always being retold and everything that we interpret about the world is in some sense a story. We're making our own story about reality. That seems much more integrated in what's happening with Operation Lapis than what's happening in something like reacting to the past. Although, and here's my boring question, Trent.
All right.
I'm wondering, how do you navigate that with respect to what is quote unquote real versus what's not? Because that student standing underneath the Arch of Titus and looking at the real Lapis, right? how much of their experience in the context of Operation Lapis bleeds into reality with assumptions about what's real about the history, the culture, the government, the economics of ancient Rome versus what actually happened in ancient Rome. I think a lot about something Trent and I mentioned in the book with respect to Assassin's Creed, where it's very easy to create this fictitious version of reality that is interesting or engaging, but is not truthful. It's maybe truthy, but it's not truthful. And I'm curious, Kevin, how do you think about navigating the relationship, especially with middle schoolers or high schoolers, getting them to understand the differences between the quote unquote real history versus the sort of fictionalized version that they're engaged with?
Yeah, that's a really great, actually not a boring question at all, Steve, despite what Trent was leading everyone to believe.
It was much better than what he usually comes up with. So.
Oh, thank you.
And actually, this is where I'll return back to the ARG framing and harken back to the myth example, because whereas the fantastical layer, right, the completely fictitious framing of you're being recruited, you're an agent, you've got these operatives here, that delivery mechanism really only works when the historical layer that is passing through, I would say, I'm going to use air quotes, the real history elements of Lapis is very, very disciplined in trying to keep it as authentic as possible. And so where the mythological immersions and to some extent the to use a famed AI phrase of the year, the load-bearing events that really require that discipline, there's a lot of areas around the edges where we just don't know what the day-to-day would be. And so there is a lot of flexibility to have some fun playing in an experience of going to the forum, in meeting a random farmer who is beaten up by a group of merchants, in getting involved in that struggle where two different ethnic groups are coming to a head. And while that is a completely unhistorical event that they're playing, it nevertheless captures the intercultural competency things that are going on with exploring just how ethnically and culturally diverse the Roman Empire was. Again, contrary to what maybe the white nationalists on X may lead you to believe, Rome was quite diverse. And when those groups came together, there were conflicts that had to be navigated in exploring those not as a monolithic culture, but rather those nuanced perspectives really earns its place because the students are a layer removed. They're not actually Romans in this. They're operatives role-playing as a Roman. And so they can bring in those modern approaches to analysis and comparing and contrasting in order to understand those perspectives a whole lot better.
Well, the modern learning objectives, I think, are really interesting and important. And I do want to come back to the question of intercultural competency in a second. There are two things you said that really jump out at me. One of them is, to your point, this is situated as the learners themselves doing these things as themselves, performing as characters to convince the simulation that they are, in fact, the thing they're pretending to be. So that sounds more complicated, I think, than
Robert Downey Jr., I'm a dude playing a dude. Who's
well, right. Like that's basically the premise here. And the value of that is it reduces the barrier to transfer much lower than it would be for something like reacting to the past, where I'm never going to believe that I am Barack Obama in the context of reacting to the past. But it's almost like you're performing a stage play where the entire thing is about breaking the fourth wall. And the transferability comes from that breaking the fourth wall, that the students are inherently having to connect. I am this person in the 21st century, pretending to be this person in the early or late or whatever era of the Roman Empire. And that's categorically different than just saying, I am X historical figure, I am Y political figure, I am redoing this event at the Treaty of Versailles or at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. They are not, in fact, trying to be that person. They are trying to analyze what that person would have potentially been thinking about or doing, which is a separate thing. The second thing that I wanted to mention really briefly is this notion that the story itself is created in such a way that the students can exert agency without having to commit to a specific version of reality. And as you were saying about the diversity and the way that we think about ancient Rome, yes, you can do what Trent and I have suggested in the world building template, where you try to account for 100% of all kinds of people. But because we have the flexibility to say, yeah, we don't know what happened on a day-to-day basis. So this person might have gotten into a fight with that person, or this person might have fallen in love with this person. All of those stories are potentially true in some sense. It's just that you're weaving together, and maybe this is the intercultural competency piece, you're weaving together the human experience with the projection of that 100% of society and the cultural truth value that existed at that time. Does that make sense or sound in any way correct based on your perspective as the person leading this or facilitating this?
Absolutely. And I would say that one other element that we haven't discussed yet is that fourth wall breaking figure that we actually have written into the narrative, right? So we have this character, this recurring character known as Sinistrus, and he's kind of this composite character of Q from Star Trek or Agent Smith from The Matrix. It's not entirely clear what his motives are, whether he's a foe, whether he's an ally, whether he's something in between, but he exists in order to break that fourth wall, even inside of the immersion space. And so he's there to remind the students of the fact that they are not actually in ancient Rome, but a simulation thereof, but also to continue to push those 21st century learning objectives and that 21st century point of view into the space that they're inhabiting. And so he does work that bridges that fantastical layer with the historical layer in a way that a lot of I would say simulations or other pedagogical tools that are doing a similar thing just don't have that reminder that you're not at the Constitutional Convention. You're not being one of the founders there coming up with this, but rather you're this injected figure that doesn't belong in that space, but you're still taking part of it. And I think it goes back to the idea that those fantastical and those wild elements are really important, but the more kind of fantastical they are, the more the internal discipline has to be in order to ensure that students don't walk away with the incorrect assumption about historical events or about the nature of the Romans or things of that nature. But it takes a lot of discipline and a lot of skill in order to pull that off in a way.
Yeah, I've got a follow-up question on that. I mean, so one thing I wanted to say too, not necessarily push back on my dear friend Steve, but I would say, like, I think reacting to the past is a thing that is way better than a standardized textbook with, multiple choice test, right? So it's like, I think it's better than that. But one of the things I was interested in, as it got me thinking about, is that it's like, is maybe reacting good for the basics, and then as you get more advanced, you're, getting more into the nitty gritty or whatever. But you're doing the exact opposite. I mean, reacting is supposed to be for college students, right? You're working with middle school students. But one of the things that I think is really an interesting tension here is if a young woman wants to, and this is what I wanted you to sort of like run through if you've had this experience or not, if a young woman wants her character in that game to do an action or be a certain way, and that is breaking the gender norms of ancient Rome, do you think it's better to allow that student to have that and have the people say, oh, that's really surprising that a woman would say that or whatever? Or do you think it's better to be like, no, this is none of your concern. Go back to, women aren't allowed to participate in the Senate, or the women aren't allowed to participate in these kinds of decisions or something like that. Are there values, do you think, of sort of like having people feel those social forces in a way in which it frustrates maybe what they as an individual want to do? Like this, I'm just thinking we had this class called Steampunk Rochester, and there was a woman who wanted to have a woman-owned speakeasy in the 1920s, and she was like hardcore, women's suffrage, whatever, and she was not going to play anybody's games. And I'm like, well, then the cops are going to bust you twice as often as they're going to bust everybody else, because that's like an uppity woman, right? They're trying to, she hated that. And I'm like, well, I'm not saying that I'm doing it. I'm saying that, historically, they probably would have picked on a woman, much more. So, and it's like, oh, well, is that limiting her agency because now she's feeling, she has to deal with that every day in her life as it is because she is a woman? Or is it better to be like, hey, and I sort of sided on the second half of this, it's better for you to be outraged by that and understand why we now have laws that don't allow people to discriminate based on race and gender. And it's like that fact that you're frustrated and you're angry is actually the point, right? Like you should be frustrated and angry that you're not allowed to do that. But what do you think? I mean, especially, do you think it's different for working with middle schoolers than it is, with essentially adults, is what we're working with in higher ed?
Yeah, I'm actually going to break this into two different categories here. I think the answer of kind of stopping things dead in their tracks is something that I both leverage and suggest others to do, but it's when you have truly anachronistic things that the students want to do. Like if a student is, like, oh, well, we'll just order a pizza for the dinner since I don't like the figs and dates that are the appetizer, right? That's where the ARG layer and the instructor isn't the one telling them they can't do that, but rather a directive from the demiurge himself says, no, this is outside of the parameters, try again. The second half of that is, I think, a little bit more complicated in that we have a very limited and narrow view of, and I'll use your example of a woman in ancient Rome. Most of our sources are written by males of the highest social order, talking about things pertaining to the highest social order.
Right.
And we have counterfactual examples of all women were oppressed that do exist. But and I think this kind of speaks to the male dominance of classics for however many hundreds of years.
Right.
Most of the time, they're just kind of hand waved of, oh, this was a unique thing for a woman here to own a piece of property after her husband died. But yet we continue to have these examples of these very strong, these very influential, these very powerful women. Yes, they may not have been elected consul, but we have evidence of very strong women doing very strong and important things, that giving students that space to kind of play out that in some way is actually quite beneficial for them to then, when they engage with the real character, the real historical figure of Clodia, who was involved in some of the biggest scandals in the middle of the 1st century BCE and may or may not be the Lesbia of Catullus fame, or Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, who arguably may be one of the most powerful women in the entire history of Rome. They engage with those figures a little bit differently because they've been allowed to see the ways that a deft facilitator can give them the affordance of pushing those boundaries rather than the stereotypes, but not give them complete license to ride into the Senate on top of a horse, declaring that they are now dictator of Rome. So does that get to
that? I mean, and this is where too, it'd be interesting to talk to somebody who actually focuses a little bit more on those kinds of things as their profession. But that's the way I feel too. That when I took a Icelandic sagas class as an undergrad, and one of the instructor was a feminist professor of Icelandic sagas, and she was saying that the women in Icelandic society were not codified, right? They weren't written into law, but they had an enormous amount of power in dictating the way. Since they divorced their husband, which was like a huge shame thing, right? And it's like, so they had a lot of really, I mean, to use a game terminology, they had a lot of really powerful cards that they could play. It's just that the system didn't recognize that, right? And it's one of those things where I feel it does our students a disservice to make it feel like we're all okay all the time, and it's like, oh, well, they should have known this or they should have known that. It's like, well, it's quite the reverse. In our historical moment, we're all dealing with opportunities and disadvantages based on who we are, and getting a clear picture of that to me seems like like sometimes you do need to work around the edges, and sometimes you do need to find the seams, or there's the person who's going to unlock the door for you that you need to convince. We have to do that all the time. Like if you're trying to get a grant, or you're trying to get anything, right? Like you need to work through the system because it's not a meritocracy. And I think there's a real value in teaching people that all of these systems and all of these societies, have forces that provide opportunities and benefits for some, and that necessarily means that it's disadvantages and not as many opportunities for other people. And then the question is, what do you do about it, or how do you feel about that, right? Which is a totally different thing than like we should just all get along and not be racist and not be sexist. It's like, well, yeah, of course. That's what, I think what most educators would be saying. But the reason why we haven't solved it yet is because it's really tricky to do, because those things are all very baked into a system that allows or doesn't allow certain actors, but that doesn't, just because the system, I guess this is where I'm trying to get to, just because the system doesn't allow for it does not necessarily relegate those people into subservient, you had no agency, you had no ability. And that's where, like what Stephen was saying, like we want to try and do the thing with the world building where you're taking into account for 100% of the people. Or like, this is where when we play Game of Thrones in my class too, is it better to be the most important person in a very minor house, or is it more important to be the most minor person in a major house, right? Like those are two different situations that you find yourself in. And I think it's really useful for students to think their way through, and then specifically be able to do the same kind of thing if they're going to go, study the Aztecs, or they're going to go study, some other culture. Well, the cultural values and the cultural norms were completely different. And if you were going to be a traveler to that world, right, not everything at the time of ancient Rome would have been operating by the rules of ancient Rome, right? And it's like, I think all of those things are really good. But then again, it's like, oh, well, women have to face enough of those challenges, or people who are trans or queer have to face enough of those challenges on a day-to-day basis. Do they also need to face it in the classroom? And I think for me, your mileage may vary. It may depend on how you set up the scenario. But I'm thinking too that the students at younger and younger levels are getting sort of this idea that the world was not always just and fine, that people have always sort of having to work against different kinds of structural or institutional problems. And teaching people that that's still going on today is not a bad it's not a bad thing, as I would sort of suggest.
There's this interrelationship between what you're describing, Trent, and the fourth wall breaking, where, and this is one of the reasons why I think back when we were first at GLS and we were first talking about text-based role-playing as a central pillar of how we were thinking about game-based education, one of the reasons we ended up on that trajectory versus the let's build an app, let's make a video game, was because the co-construction of the world is more important for getting students to reflect on those inequities and understand that these systems are not fixed. And not only are they not fixed, but that all of these perspectives, ideological perspectives or otherwise, have existed forever. It's just that the control of the system, however you're defining the system, has fluctuated over time. That at some point in history, you have had monarchy, and other times you've had democracy. And it's always localized, right? That different tribes have different perspectives on how different kinds of people should live. And so it's never all one thing or all the other thing. There is an opportunity for the students to self-insert and understand personally that they may be on the more oppressed side or the more privileged side. And then they have to discuss amongst themselves and co-construct what reality do we want, and then connect that back to the present and say, okay, well, this is the version of reality we're in now. How do you want this reality to look 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from the present? And how are you going to connect the different political or economic, cultural, or social philosophies of the time? How are you going to connect all those things to what you're learning about the ancient world versus the present? And how do you see the actors in the present reflected in what we know about the past? What is the sort of connective tissue between those two things?
Yeah. I think too, along with that, and I guess Kevin, you could speak to this too, because like you just said, there's the fourth wall where there's the fourth wall, and there's the fact that they are playing themselves in a foreign place. But what happens if they violate, like the pizza one is sort of like a funny, okay, well, we know that they don't have takeout pizza, right? But what happens if it's a little bit more nuanced? Like, this is one of the things that I always like to go off on Game of Thrones, and I love Game of Thrones, but it's like there's a lot of the stuff that happens with identity with Arya Stark that requires you to have psychology, right? Like that psychology did not exist until the 20th century, right? Especially child psychology about identity and what it means to be an actor in history or whatever, and it's totally anachronistic. And the point that I always make is, well, it's anachronistic because George R. R. Martin isn't writing for a medieval audience, he's writing for a modern audience, right? So it would seem really hard. But when you get into you're trying to get into the head of somebody who has a very different value system, right? Like, oh, well, why are you even asking for that? That's insulting for you to do this or do that, or right? How into the weeds do you get with that? Because I mean, the students that you're dealing with are what, 13, 14?
Yeah, now, yes. Yeah. I think this is where, in the last decade or so, ACTFL, which is the parent language teaching organization in the country, has really developed a robust framework to go back to intercultural competency and things of that nature. And, I think, and you guys probably will remember this from language classes that you may have taken in school, that culture was like the thing you learned about maybe on, Culture Fridays or something.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you read the English section in the back of the textbook. And it was just about acquiring facts, knowledge bits about a people, about things they did. Oh, isn't that weird how they ate with their hands, or things of that nature. And instead, the emphasis is really investigating what Ifra calls those products and those practices. That is, the things they made and the things they did, in order to try and understand perspectives, right? And so the try and understand perspectives is the part that's doing the real work there, because ultimately I will never know what it's like to be a female identifying lesbian in the 1950s, right? I could never even fathom to claim that I would understand what that was like, but I can try to understand what the perspective might have been like for somebody.
It's empathy. Exactly.
Empathy, exactly. Yeah. And, I think that the actful descriptor is something like building this process of understanding those perspectives is like taking a mosaic of cultural experiences informed by your own self-reflection, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the really part of the process. And so having a student pushing those boundaries actually then opens that door to help them to build that self-reflection process to say, okay, why is it that you're feeling angst about the way this banker dealt with your character's demand for money, when as a woman in ancient Rome, you may not have been able to make your own contracts and business dealings, or you might have, and we just don't have the records that validate that.
Right.
And so that process of that self-reflection helps to build that empathy and that understanding of different perspectives.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking too about two different kind of time periods, both ancient Egypt and then also the Middle Ages, in which, the process, the idea of the society that is clergy, noble, and then, the common people or whatever. It's like, if that's what you were born into and that's all you ever knew and that's all everyone you've ever known ever knew, you are not naturally questioning that and feeling like your life is not in your hands. The idea that your life is in your hands is an Enlightenment idea, right? So it's like, that's why there weren't serfs that were rising up and rebelling all of the time, is because they just kind of took it for granted that that's what they were supposed to be doing. And it's the same, I read something that was interesting about the slaves under the pharaohs who were building the pyramids, that, this argument was, well, they actually were taken care of pretty well, right? I mean, like, they got blocks dropped on them, but they got food, they got to party, whatever. And it's like, oh, well, you're not a pharaoh. And if you're not a pharaoh, then this is what you do, right? And I think it's super important for students to also see in 100 years, I'm sure you guys will say this, 100 years, 150 years, people will look back and they're like, wait, you bought your jeans from Amazon? Like, didn't you realize that was deforesting, Brazil? And it's like, oh, but everybody was doing it, right? And that's where it's very easy to go back and I think point to those things and say that society was wrong and those people were dumb, or like during, like what we're seeing right now with all this stuff, if the Nazis had come up, when I was in, I would have spoken out against them. And it's like, oh, are you? Because that's happening like right now in the United States. And it does not seem like a whole lot of people are saying, I'm going to come out of my house and march in the streets until this is resolved. It seems more like not my problem, So and I think those are the things too, where again, are you teaching students so then they can regurgitate something onto a test? Are you teaching students that there are these systems of power that we choose or blindly sort of are following? And I think that again, I've said this before, but I think that this is where the idea of like a really robust humanities education is absolutely a threat to power. And that is why we're seeing so much being thrown against it right now, is not because nobody learned anything and didn't learn to critical think. It's the exact opposite. They did learn. Generations of people from the 70s on did learn. And that's where we get things like the civil rights movement. And that's where we get, all these, like, oh, I don't need to sit and be idle and I don't have any power. It's in fact quite the opposite. And I think that that's where I was just posting about this earlier on Facebook, that's, in my mind, the people who are in power absolutely know what they're doing, right? It's not that education doesn't help and classics is useless. It's quite the opposite.
Right, because even if you get to the point where you are capable of not just identifying, but evaluating those perspectives, I think the magical power there is to be able to do that evaluation without judgment and to spin things around, right? The people in power that want to keep the animosity, that want to keep the various factions, right, at each other's throats, lean into, no, you should be judging, right? These people are different than you. You're better than them. Their ideas are crazy. And that true plateau, right? The thing you're looking for in that intercultural competency is to be able to do that analysis, to do that evaluation without passing judgment, but rather, what does this tell me about these people, these perspectives, these ideas, this point in history, not for saying this was right, wrong, good, or bad, but rather, what can I learn about what it was to be an ordinary citizen in Berlin in the 1930s, right? And it's easy just to say, well, they were terrible because they didn't speak out against. And it's like, well, we look around and, we see that same kind of stuff happening. So.
Yeah, it definitely repeats itself.
The dispassionate analysis piece is really important. And it's interesting in the context of Latin or language education specifically because you're co-constructing that understanding, not just in your own language with your own culture, but also using language to do the construction of the thing you're trying to construct. So the enculturation is embedded in the learning objectives. I was thinking about this as you were talking about the cultural Fridays or whatever, right? That is such a silly, disconnected way to think about teaching any of this, because as Trent and I have pointed out time and time again, all of these systems are interconnected with one another. It's not like you can just pull out the politics part and let the rest of the system operate.
Right.
That is actually fundamentally integral to the way that the entire ecosystem is working. It's like if you went into Yellowstone National Park and you remove all the deer, well, that's going to affect the food web. You can't just take one piece out of the food web and have it still function. So the language construction piece in a language education environment is critical to learners being able to make sense of these cultural truth values and then be able to connect them to one another. So when it comes to this dispassionate analysis, I think to get at what Trent is talking about with the threat posed by teaching people about the humanities, it's that you're helping students understand that, for one thing, all of the things that they're experiencing in their day-to-day lives are connected, that, as we've frequently said, not everything is partisan, but everything is political, and that the economic system and the cultural systems and the social relationships, all of these things are necessarily connected to each other, and that if a learner understands that you can pluck one of those strings and have it vibrate all the way to the other side of the web, that becomes extremely empowering because it shows you where are the weak points in the power structures that exist and allows you to exploit them to change the system in ways that probably wouldn't be favorable to somebody like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Donald Trump, right? It is fundamentally a threat to them because critical thought and empathy empowers you to do the dispassionate analysis to figure out what can I do to make the world better in the way I want it to be better.
Right. And I was going to say, too, as you were talking, I was thinking log cabin Republicans, and thinking about how this works in my world building classes is that students often want to make things too neat and tidy. And it's like, if you were gay, why in the world would you be Republican? And I'm like, Exhibit A, log cabin Republicans, right? These people exist. They find a way. Like, I find that amazing too, but they find a way to say, hey, look, their values about small government outweigh their values about, having equal rights as somebody who's gay. And I'm like, I don't get it, but it exists. And I think, Steve, we've talked about this too with like white nationalism, is that if you are from an elite university in the Northeast, you don't understand how somebody in, rural South Carolina, it's like they're just bad people or whatever. And it's like, well, no, they're operating under a completely different system that you grew up with, right, in terms of education. And I think what you keep bringing back, not I was going to say harping on, but that's the wrong way to say it. The thing that you keep bringing back up, too, is like the media ecosystem. What are the texts that they're even having available to them, right? And it's like, there are, and this is one of the things that drives me crazy. You need to be understanding how people arrived at their conclusions and then start to test and worry the quality of the information that they received. And I was just talking about this with somebody, I went to the University of Wisconsin, very liberal, very, People's Republic of Madison is what people often will call it. And I don't remember a single professor trying to indoctrinate anybody. What they basically said is, we want you to think about being in these other people's shoes, and would you like it? And if you wouldn't like it, what don't you like about it, and how would you fix it? And that's kind of the thing that changed my mind. Is it's like, oh, well, I'm a white kid from Green Bay, Wisconsin, sort of upper middle class or whatever. And it's like, well, imagine if you weren't that. It's like, what?
Right.
Yeah, imagine if you were poor, and imagine if you were, a minority, and imagine if you were, whatever, this and that. And I'm like, oh, well, I wouldn't like that very much at all, right? It's like those people got to deal with a
Yeah.
lot of bullshit, right? And it's like, yeah, that's the point. Do you think that they should because you just won the lottery of, birth? But yeah, and I think that's all that kind of stuff too, that can never start too early. And it's like, oh, well, if your solution is, like I was saying to Steve in this one of these last episodes, if your solution is, oh, well, it's not, like the world doesn't work that way, tough luck. Like I totally disagree with that, but at least I appreciate the honesty rather than trying to manufacture false data that leads to your conclusion. If you just want to be like, oh, well, might makes right. Well, okay, that's maybe not the most enlightened thing, but at least it's honest.
Yeah, and I think that's where the distance between us and the ancient world really is something that we can leverage. I think for a long time and in certain pockets still, right, there's still this glorification of Rome, right?
Hmm.
It's
I think about it every
the
day.
Right, exactly. I actually do think about Rome every day. So to answer that question daily, but that has shifted, at least among the kind of the upper echelon of critical thinkers in the field and beyond, is less about the glory of Rome and less about going back to like the Cultural Fridays thing, right? Here's what the Romans did, but rather it's this sense of, well, here's how the Romans saw the world. Here's how they saw themselves in that world. Here's now we're really investigating and really interested in how others saw the Romans,
Yeah.
both in their world and in the Roman world. And the key then is to be able to then say and help build the capacity in learners to say, all right, here's what noticing the discrepancy between those things teaches me about what it was like to be in the Roman world of 2,000 years ago, and then to be able to transfer that to building those skills and those capacities to be able to look at my existing world
Yeah.
through not the exact same lens, but the same scaffolding of those lenses to be able to better understand why is it that two cultures colliding there in the West Bank are exactly having the same issues that cultures who have collided in that way throughout history have always had. And what is it about when those cultures meet and their values, their ideals, their even religious backgrounds are at odds with one another? And how does one navigate that impossible line to navigate?
Yeah.
And it's not this, I solved it in 3 weeks solution. It's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more complicated and a lot harder to unpack and untangle. But if you can't do that work to really understand the perspectives of everybody involved,
Yeah.
you're never going to make any kind of gains or improvement.
Yeah, it's really fascinating too, because that makes me think, like when I do this trip to Spain, one of the things that the people will often say is that religion was the major thing that divided people, not race, right? So like if you were living in any of these cities and they were very multi-mixed, the number one thing would be not the color of your skin, but it would be what version of God, or what kind of version
Right.
of monotheism do you believe in? And this last time, and these guys are always so great. But she said, if we had 20 people standing in front of us that were from Cordoba in the 12th century or whatever, you would have a 0% chance of going through and picking through who is the Muslim, who is the Christian, and who is the Jew, because they all look the same, they all
Exactly.
dress the same, and they were more about being Cordobans than they were about being any of those. So it's like, well, we got to watch out for Granada, we got to watch out for Sevilla, or whatever. Much more so than you're black and I don't like you, and even you're a Jewish person and I don't like you, right? It's much more like, hey, do we trade? You know what I mean? You do your thing on Sunday, I do it on Saturday night, and it's like, well, we can all get along. And it's crazy to me that in this current state that we're in, that we are definitely going backwards in the way that we present these things. I think in most of our K through 12, right? If we really were having this, leftist attack on values and things like that, it's like, yeah, like the fact that people have gotten along in different periods and when they're very culturally diverse, like that's happened a lot in the world.
Right.
And why aren't we studying more why that has been successful rather than driving these wedges deeper? And of course, me being the cynic would say, because the people in charge know exactly what they're doing, right? It's not an accident.
There's something super interesting about this that I hadn't considered before, but the relationship between looking at the present and looking at the past is very much the same as the famous Gick and Holyoake study about transfer and how case-based reasoning works. The value of studying the ancient world and comparing it to the present is literally the same thing as they were describing with respect to asking learners to compare an attack on a castle versus how you do treatment of a brain tumor, which I realize sounds really strange as a comparison point, but the main issue they were grappling with was helping learners detect invariance between situations and then talk about the cracks that exist in that difference between them. So yeah, maybe one person is looking at the way you divide and conquer around a medieval castle, and another person is looking at how do you divide a radiation beam to target the tumor tissue as opposed to the healthy tissue. The cross comparison of those two situations, they have the same solution. It's just that the content is different. And you can do the same thing with historical case-based reasoning too. And so it really lends credibility to the idea that getting students to do the reflection is what matters more than anything else. And the transferability that comes from that is the reason why we keep advocating for these methods that are themselves not terribly sellable because they're sort of abstract concepts and not a product that you can mass produce and put in a warehouse. But that's the reason why we got so invested in this particular line of pedagogical development to begin with, is that it does this thing that a product cannot do, which is facilitate somebody's deep dive into what makes a society and where are the benefits and detriments of different kinds of ways of living. Where can we see similarities and differences across time and then take lessons from the past to be able to implement in the present? It's just there's a very nice analogy there for somebody who wants to do discovery learning or case-based learning in their classroom.
It makes me think too. When I was at Origins this summer, Jared Fishman of the 20 Roll, I think it's a 20-sided podcast. We should maybe have him on and talk about this game that he's working on. It's basically a medieval sort of management game in which one player is the crown and then the others are nobles. And one of the mechanics that I love is instead of going to war, you got to bring everybody to the battlefield and then you decide, are we going to do this thing or are we going to back off? Right. And he's like, because that happened a lot. Right. It's like, oh man, the odds are not good enough here. And it's going to be extremely expensive for me to actually have these people to fight. Right. So then, and I happen to be the crown in this game. We were playing with 3 other people. And I'm like, okay, well, I got to make these people all happy enough that they don't want to rebel and turn them against this guy, right? And I had the one guy who's like, I'm going for it. I'm going for the crown. And he had a terrible roll, right? It's like, what are the odds of getting that? It's like, he had a 30% chance of losing and he lost. And then it's like, oh, well, then the other 2 turned on him and it's like, yeah, see, that's a great example of game-based learning, right? It's like, I didn't want to go for the war. He pushed it. And then the table talk was all like, you fool. You know what I mean? Like, it's much better, to be rewarded by the Lord. And it's like, oh man, but, Jared was saying he hates playing the king because the king is always trying to, like, everybody's out to get you and you're trying to pacify. And that was one of the things that we talked about is it would be really fun to play that in like 5-6 sessions in a row. Like I managed to get through like a year, like a couple years or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, the real skill were the Charlemagnes who are able to, turn it into, they're able to do that over generations of opponents, right? And that's where the real skill is, not just doing it as a one-off and having one good result. But I'll see if you can come on. Maybe we could play it together because it's to me, it's one of those things where I'm like, this is perfect. This is leveraging the stuff like, but I want to go to war because war is cool. And it's like, no, you don't. It's expensive, right? It is really expensive. It was a last result. Or
I was told you just have to change the name to Department of War,
Department
and that makes it scarier and stronger than Department of Defense.
Of course it is, yeah.
So one last question, I guess, as we're getting toward the end here. I'm kind of curious, Kevin, where do you think this goes from here? Because you've spent the better part of 15 years working on Operation Lapis and really building out this text-based role-playing game. Technology obviously is continuing to evolve and emerge, and is that influencing the way that your learners are engaging with this in any meaningful way, or do you find that the system itself is very adaptable regardless of the kinds of technology that have emerged over the last 15 years?
I would say in a lot of ways, the technological enhancements have reduced the barrier of entry. Although, and I'm sure Trent can agree with this as well, the barrier of entry on any kind of role-playing experience is still very, very high for a lot of learners and for a lot of instructors too, right? There is, I think, this built-in sense of, I don't want to say inadequacy, but like being exposed as a fraud if you can't role play these historical figures or to do all that stuff. And so while I think that, we have something really powerful, really magical here. It's also really hard for people to conceptualize how it operates, but also to buy in as well.
Mhm.
And the buy-in has to be really high. Like you have to be committed to all of the bits. And I think that's where, at least in terms of buy-in, reacting to the past does have a structural advantage in that it is a very narrow, self-contained unit.
Right.
So if you have the learner who is like, I don't want to be James Madison here. I'm going to just do this begrudgingly. That's fine because they can do the pre-research, they can write the paper at the end and still get a good grade without role-playing James Madison very, very well. And the performance is not the point. Whereas, with something like LAPIS, the performance really is the point because it's in the performance that you are showing and demonstrating that ability to synthesize this information and to understand the perspectives and all of that kind of stuff. And so that's a really good segue to kind of the what I've been working on off and on, really coming out of COVID, but the latest advancements in AGI has allowed me to do this in a way that I just wasn't able to before. And that is take this rich narrative world that we've created, this tabletop facsimile of a tabletop role-playing game, and convert it into a choose your own adventure experience. I should say choose your own path, because I don't want to be sued and cease and desist. A choose your own path experience where you can still leverage a lot of the similar affordances of imagining what it's like to be the characters, but the onus has shifted from you having to come up with all of the answers, but rather to think and reflect on different paths that one could take. And so that barrier of entry probably is reduced exponentially, but still gets you about 90 to probably 95% of the good in the role-playing experience. And so the latest work that I've been doing is rebuilding the Latin RPG into this massive, sprawling choose your own path experience. And that's work that just could not have been done even 6 months ago. The ability to have a companion, in this case, I call him Claude, help map out this sprawling nodes of all of these interconnected paths and to keep it sorted. I look at the first two missions that I did by hand, and the sheer volume of errors and things that I've had to go back and retroactively fix because I thought the path worked, and then suddenly actually building it out, no, something went wrong from my translation from paper to digital pages. Having an AI companion be able to hold and keep track of all of those paths and connect them appropriately has been invaluable in allowing this work to move forward. And, I think there's a lot of angst right now about how much we're leveraging AI because it has crept right into every aspect of our lives, whether it belongs or not. But in terms of structural mechanical stuff, AI, even at its current state, is exponentially better than any human really could ever be at keeping track of organization, about holding things, threads from, 8 missions ago. It's, hey, this character that you seeded back in mission 14, this might be a good opportunity to inject them here in 22, and it would make perfect sense. And you're like, yes, that's brilliant. That's, that is something that, maybe a revision 3 times down the road would have said, oh, actually, let's bring this character back in. And then the structural technological aspects are just irreplaceable. To hand code all of the HTML and all of the pages that make up nearly 1,900 story nodes is an impossible task. Whereas building that template, building that structure, AI can produce those shells a whole lot better and a whole lot faster than I could ever do by hand, or a team, or a multi-$100,000 cost to produce those can be done in an afternoon. And that's where I think that technological advances really leverage and allow the focus to be less on the mechanical implementation, but rather really thinking deeply about the story, about the objectives, and about the delivery and the pedagogy of those things.
It's really important, I think, to clarify for anybody listening that the real value here is the example I keep going back to is if you had the Walking Dead role-playing game, tabletop role-playing game, and you wanted to consolidate all of those ideas that you came up with for a campaign into something that someone who had never played a role-playing game would be able to pick up and use, it would probably look something like the Telltale Walking Dead series.
Yeah.
But the development of that is very costly in terms of time and energy and money. And our goal as educators, and I think I'm speaking for all three of us here, is to get this stuff in the hands of as many people as possible, because we want them to do the reflection and the case-based reasoning and the co-construction of information that is necessary for somebody to be able to evaluate their real lived-in world more effectively. So it's really easy to be able to say all AI is bad. There are no good uses for it. And I'm probably more in that camp than I am the I love AI and want it injected into everything, whether it belongs or not. It's obviously a spectrum, but this is one of the cases where I think, as somebody who's done a lot of public scholarship, there's something really valuable about being able to go to an educator who has very minimal experience or exposure to games, especially role-playing games, or facilitating and moderating a role-playing game, and be able to say to them, here's something you could utilize with your students that is constrained enough that you don't have to do all the overhead that would be necessary to plan a Dungeons and Dragons style campaign. It's something that's simple enough, that's straightforward enough, but also introduces enough opportunities for student reflection that you can get a lot of mileage out of it, even if you're not doing all that manual labor that may add some real value, but is not going to be possible for the vast majority of people. And I would much rather have more educators doing better teaching than I would squirrel away the opportunity to do this for just the very few who understand the mechanisms of running a tabletop role-playing game.
And that's what, one of the things too that as you were talking, Kevin, and I was thinking that how much of it, like we've talked about this before, Steve and I have, about the language students will say something's fun, and what I wish they would probably say is that it's engaging, right? You know what I mean? It's like they separate engagement, and it's because it's engaging that it becomes fun. And it's the same thing where I'm even finding, this, one of my colleagues, Christian Son at RPI, has been using the language gameful and playful learning rather than game, because it's more like it's an attitude, right, rather than an actual thing. So it's like, oh, we're going to do this exercise. It's a gameful exercise, or it's a playful exercise that is engaging. You know what I mean? And it's like, that's the same thing as saying we're going to play a fun game, but it's loaded with the language that makes it sound like it's rigorous and whatever. And that's one of the things I feel like, just recently now, because I think post-COVID, I'm seeing more educators interested in trying to maybe take a stab at doing games, right? It's one of those things where it's like, the game that I was just describing that Jared has made, that was not fun in a way that playing like Zombie Flux is fun, right? It was stressful. Like every round I felt like I was going to blow it. And I was deeply like, what do I do now, right? And it's like at the end, it's like, oh, well, in one sense, I couldn't wait to turn around and play it again. But in another sense, it wasn't fun in the slightest bit, right? It was like, it was anxiety producing, and, in the best way, trying to figure out what are because the king has different mechanics than the other people. So I'm like, well, what do I need to do this time, and how is it going to blow up in my face, right? Which is, it's enjoyable and it was engaging, but it was not what I would call silly and fun. And I think that that's where people who don't understand games enough think that is the point, is that it's got to be fun and it's got to be gratifying. It's like, no, actually, the engagement, if you build it well, and that's the thing, is you could make a fun game that doesn't teach you anything, and you could teach a game that isn't really fun, but it teaches you a ton. And I think that that's where, all of us would be on that side of the house, where it's like, if it's a game and the mechanic, they may describe it as fun, but what it actually means is we are putting the content into context and being able to draw our own conclusions from it, which makes education fun, right?
Right.
But we just need more of those kinds of interventions and interactions. I think, the other one too is like AI. Well, are you talking about all LLMs? Are you talking about specific ones, right? And I think we just don't have the grammar right now to be precise enough about it. And everything that we do, or how we clothe, how we consume media, all those things take resources. And I feel like we're going to be maybe heading towards a territory in which we're talking about how we use LLMs for really efficient use, versus AI is going to get crammed up every crevice you have, whether you like it or not. And I think that that's where, like, when we've been talking about this on our Slack channel and whatever, it always comes back around to, okay, well, you're kind of making a deal with the devil when you're using it. But on the other hand, when you think about the amount of hours that it would take somebody to do all of this
Right.
stuff, right? There's definitely value there where you're not making stupid AI videos of people's legs splitting open and crocodiles coming out. You know what I mean? It's like, I think we all can kind of agree that's not worth the water. But, for something like coming up with this, like I'd said the same thing. I'm working on a Twine program where I got more done literally in 3 days than I did with 2 students working an entire semester using Claude
Right.
Code, right? And it's like, it's hard to argue with that, right? And it's like, well, just don't do that. And I'm like, but this got me to a point where
Right.
I'm going to have a product that other people can actually interact with, and it's going to be really cool. That I don't have the money to hire a team of programmers, and even when I had 2 student programmers, they couldn't get anywhere near it because I couldn't articulate well enough. So I don't know. I just
Right.
think all of
Right.
this stuff maybe is heading down those. You just hope. I mean, the thing that Steve and I have talked about too is the biggest drawback to all the games and learning stuff is you need to have educators who are involved and understand and know how to pivot on a dime, and all those kind of things. And it's about training the people rather than having the product that does it for you. Because as you were talking too, Kevin, I was saying, oh, it's basically assessment, right? When you get down to it,
Right.
what are you assessing? Are you assessing the role play? No, you're assessing the critical thinking and the reflection about why they did what they did, regardless of
Right.
whether they did it well or not. And that's just a question of, well, then what does your principal or what does your provost say when you say, oh, we're not assessing this, we're assessing that? And hopefully they say that's good, right? But it's not metric based. It's not metrics based, rather. It's not driven by, data in the same way.
Right. And I think, Trent, you also hit on something really important with the use of AI, and that, from an educator perspective, there is a high degree of need to be able to articulate precisely what it is that you're trying to accomplish, the pedagogy behind it, or else, the generative AI is just going to produce slop, right? That does not achieve what you're looking for. And as this becomes more and more prevalent in education space, I'm not sure we have the capacity at scale with people who are equipped with the skills in terms of learning design and pedagogy, and why they want the content produced in the way that they want it produced, and what the goals are. Anybody can create content, but whether or not that content is good or well designed or well thought out is an entirely different ballgame. And I think for the vast majority of models still, without the right input, you're just not going to get the results. And so you see that, I think, a lot in our space, right? The academic space, you're seeing a lot of knee-jerk reaction to the affordances of AI because either they're not using it in the right way, or they just don't have the skills right now to be able to leverage what it is that it's really good at. But as it becomes more and more prevalent too, it's going to force that conversation because, and we've seen this in language instruction for quite some time now, right? The advent of Google Translate meant that Spanish teachers, probably more than anybody else, really had to think about their pedagogy in a way that they hadn't, in the 80s and 90s, right? Translation as the goal was no longer workable because students could just translate. So then it became, well, what are you going to do with the content to demonstrate that you're taking it to those higher order thinking skills rather than just that bare minimum?
Yeah, that's great. And that's, it's funny too, because I always think when, we've all been innovators moving fast and, whatever with our educational sort of approaches or whatever. But I'm like, why doesn't anybody everyone knows what a pop quiz is. And if you give them, everyone just assumes that it's good and it's doing good work, right? And it's like, why don't we ever interrogate whether these things that we've all inherited are actually doing what we think they're doing? Because I think when you look a little closer, they're not, right? It's like they are privileging a certain kind of learning and a certain type of student and whatever, and it's not necessarily the best. So then it's like, well, why are you going to drop like essays? And it's just, and I think this is your comparison with Google Translate is exactly right on. Well, is it the translation that's important? Is it writing an essay that's important? Or is it the thought process that go behind why we do translation and why we do essays that is the part that we're actually trying to teach? And that's the part that I think, too, for people who get it, we're in the minority. I'll be so bold to say that we get it, but we're in the minority, and it's not always going to be the most efficient thing to do, to do good learning, which is sad but true. And hopefully we will someday sort of take that on board, that maybe good learning is what schools should be doing rather than making money.
Efficient results.
Efficiencies.
The only thing I would add to this is I think there's a really great conversation that Chris Hayes had with Dr. Timnit Gebru, who is the former ethics researcher at Google who was responsible for working on AI. And they had a really good conversation in an episode of Chris's podcast, Why Is This Happening? That's specifically about what terminology are we using when we describe the thing called AI, because a lot of the models or a lot of the tools that exist are not AI, like putting that in air quotes. They're not general artificial intelligence. They are specific large language models that have been trained to do a specific thing. And in a different context, you would call it something like neural networking, or you would call it statistical modeling, right? There's different ways you can think about it. And I think there's a parallel in education as well with respect to what do we really mean when we say assessment? What do we really mean when we say instruction? And this gets back to something Trent and I have talked at length about, which is a lot of educators haven't had sufficient instructional design experience to really know what good design looks like. And that's, I think, what, to summarize this conversation, we're talking about is trying to figure out how do you actually build the thing you mean to build, and what is it actually achieving when you implement it? Because I can imagine a version of Operation Lapis that has the same epic fail pathway that the anchored instruction Jasper Woodbury series had, that the same trajectory that Pappert's logo had, that all of these technologies that were assimilated like the Borg into education sort of fell apart. And I don't want to see that happen with Lapis or with similar tabletop role-playing informed kinds of teaching, because it does introduce these higher order thinking skills that matter so much more than just the regurgitation of what does this word mean in Latin instead of English.
Right.
Well, with that said, we should probably wrap up here. I want to thank Kevin again for coming on and having this conversation with us. Kevin, is there anything you want to add or plug here at the end of our interview?
No, not at all. Thank you for having me on to have this conversation. This was great. And the work that you guys are doing and talking about these issues, I think is important work. And not enough people are thinking about just the way in which all of this is also a part of instructional design, because ultimately humans are learning best through stories, and we always have and we always will, in designing our educational structures around how to leverage those stories, and the world building that goes in that is hugely important. So thank you guys for doing this work.
Yeah. Well, I think, we recorded that we had a 30% increase in our listenership. And I think when we go public, we're not going to really mention that it went from 6 to 9 people, but, that's... We're going to sell it. We're going to, do a venture capital presentation. But yeah, our nine listeners are really going to get a lot out of this particular conversation. But no, seriously, it's great to talk to somebody smart, because normally I'm just talking with Steve. So, but no, this is
fewer boring questions this way.
Fewer boring questions. That's right. No, it's good stuff.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. We'll be back at you next time with something else fun and exciting, and we appreciate you tuning in.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Stephen Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.